The first thing I heard when I woke up from a 3-week coma was my stepmother's voice saying one word so quietly I almost didn't catch it. Finally. I didn't open my eyes. I don't know exactly why. Some instinct kicked in before my conscious mind had even fully figured out where I was. Before I'd registered the smell of the room, the hum of the machines, the specific weight of hospital silence that you don't find anywhere else on earth. Something deep and animal inside me said, "Be still." So I was. And then my stepmother said 7 more words, meant for my father, spoken in the low voice of someone who had been saying things in hospital rooms for 3 weeks and had grown comfortable with the assumption that nobody who mattered was listening. "One more signature and it's all ours." My father said nothing. That silence told me more about the last 21 days than anything else I would learn in the hours that followed. And what I learned in those hours would change everything. Not just for me, but for every person who had spent 3 weeks standing over the bed of a woman they believed could not hear them. My name is Nadia Voss. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of what my mother built, and what I almost lost because of the 2 people I trusted most. But to understand what they almost took, you need to understand who built it and why. My mother's name was Claire. She died of aggressive ovarian cancer when I was 14 years old. She spent the last 8 months of her life doing something I didn't fully understand until I was old enough to understand it. Making absolutely certain that what she had spent 18 years building would reach me, and not the people who would come after her. My mother was a commercial real estate developer. Not large scale. She didn't build towers or manage institutional portfolios. She found undervalued properties in mid-size markets, bought them at the right moment, renovated them with the care of someone who understood that a building's character was just as much an asset as its square footage, and leased them to tenants she chose with that same careful attention. She had done this for 18 years and she was exceptionally good at it. She was also precise. She kept records the way architects keep drawings, with the understanding that accuracy was not bureaucracy but protection, and that the protection was for the people who came after her, not for herself. When she died, she left me 3 commercial properties in a trust structured so it could not be accessed until I turned 25. She left me shares in the small property company she had founded. She left a separate fund that would cover my education and living expenses until the trust activated. And she left a letter that her attorney delivered to me on my 25th birthday, sealed in an envelope with my name on the outside in her handwriting. The letter said, among other things, that she had thought carefully about the structure of what she was leaving, and had made it as protected as she knew how. She said she was not naive about what money did to people who hadn't earned it, and who believed they had a claim on it anyway. She said the protections were not because she didn't trust me. They were because she did trust me, and she wanted to make sure that trust was honored by the systems around me, even when the people around me were not trustworthy. I read that letter on my 25th birthday sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold. I thought about it again 3 years later in a hospital room, lying completely still with my eyes closed, listening to my stepmother's voice. My mother had known something it took me 11 years to learn. My father, his name is Warren, remarried 4 years after my mother died, just as I was leaving for college. The timing felt managed rather than coincidental. He had been seeing my stepmother, Sandra, for at least a year before he told me about her. I know this because I found a photograph of the 2 of them dated 8 months before her first dinner at our house, filed in a folder in his office where I'd been looking for something else entirely. I was 17. I had already learned which observations in my household were welcome, and which ones closed doors. So I said nothing. Sandra presented herself as warmth itself when I met her. She was polished in the way of someone who had been maintaining a carefully crafted version of herself for an audience since her 20s. She was kind to me at every dinner I attended. She asked about my studies. She remembered details from previous conversations. She expressed what seemed like genuine interest in my mother's real estate background. She asked, on 3 separate occasions in my final year of high school, questions about the trust structure my mother had left. I answered generally because I didn't yet have the framework to understand why those questions were arriving in the sequence they were arriving in. My godmother Sylvia did. Sylvia Hale had been my mother's closest friend since their 20s. She had been named my godmother when I was born, and had attended every significant event of my life with the steady presence of someone who takes that role seriously. She was 62. a retired estate attorney who had helped draft some of the protective language in my mother's trust documents. She met Sandra at my high school graduation dinner. She called me the next morning. She said, "Be careful of her questions." I said she seemed genuinely interested. Sylvia said, "She is genuinely interested. That is exactly what I'm telling you to be careful of." I didn't understand then. I would understand 4 years later in a hospital room. I moved to Atlanta after college. I had a business administration degree and I went to work for a commercial property management company. Not because I needed the income, but because I wanted to understand the industry my mother had built her life in before I took responsibility for what she had left me. 3 years of learning how buildings worked as businesses, how tenant relationships were maintained, how the gap between a property's condition and its potential was identified and closed. I turned 25 the March before the accident. Sylvia gave me my mother's letter. I activated the trust. I met with the trust's independent financial manager, a woman named Grace, who had been managing the account since my mother's death, and who greeted me with the warmth of someone who has been waiting a long time to finally meet the person they've been working for. The trust held 3 commercial properties, the company shares, and an investment account that 10 years of conservative management had grown to an amount that took me a moment to absorb when Grace showed me the statement. My mother had been careful. She had been very, very careful. Sandra's behavior shifted the week after my 25th birthday. The questions became less general. She asked about specific properties. She asked about the company's board structure. She asked whether I had considered updating the trust management arrangements now that I was the controlling beneficiary. I gave general answers. I mentioned it to my father. He said she was just interested in my success, that she cared about me. I noted the deflection. I didn't push. That was in March. The accident was in September. I had been driving home from a property inspection on a Thursday evening. A secondary highway, the kind where the late afternoon light makes it genuinely difficult to judge distances. A truck running a red at a junction I was crossing with the right-of-way. I don't remember the impact. I remember the light before it and then nothing until the hospital room 3 weeks later. The doctors told me afterward that I had been in a medically induced coma for 11 days, and then a natural coma for another 10. They told me my brain activity had been showing signs of returning awareness in the days before I actually woke. They told me my recovery was remarkable given the severity of the injury. They told me all of this after. While I was in the coma, people had spoken freely. Visitors came. Nurses came. My father came. Sandra came. They spoke in the lowered voices of people in medical spaces, and they said things that the unconscious woman in the bed was not supposed to be processing. The body was processing everything. I came back slowly. Sound first, then light through my eyelids, then the ability to locate myself in space, then thought arriving in fragments that assembled themselves gradually into coherent understanding over a period of hours on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the accident. I knew where I was before I opened my eyes, by the sounds, by the smell, by the specific texture of the sheet against my hands. Then the door opened. 2 sets of footsteps. One I recognized as Sandra's, a pattern I had been hearing for 13 years. One I recognized as my father's. The door closed behind them. Sandra moved to the side of the bed. She looked at the monitors for a moment. Then she said it. Finally. I controlled my breathing with the same focused attention I use when something important is happening, and panic would only cost me information. Sandra turned toward my father and said 7 more words in the voice of someone delivering the final update in a project that was almost complete. 1 more signature and it's all ours. My father said nothing. I lay completely still and I cataloged. 1 more signature. Not we hope she recovers. Not the doctors think she's improving. 1 more signature. The language of a transaction in progress, of someone who had been working through a sequence and had arrived at the final step and was expressing relief at its proximity, not at the consciousness of the person she was standing over. All ours. Not hers. Not the family's. Ours. A closed circle. 2 people. My father had not told her to stop. Then came the second conversation a few minutes later. Sandra asking when someone named Hargrove was coming. My father saying tomorrow morning at 9. Sandra saying tell him to bring the full transfer documentation. My father saying I will. I noted the name. I noted tomorrow morning. I noted full transfer documentation. Then I noted something else. My father's voice had the quality of a man following instructions, not participating in a conversation between equals. Not reluctant, not coerced, just a man who had handed the direction of something to someone else and stopped thinking of the direction as his to question. That told me more about the 3 weeks I had been unconscious than anything Sandra had said. They left at 11:40. I lay still for 20 minutes after the door closed. Then I opened my eyes. I took inventory. My body was present in the ways that mattered. I could move my hands. I could turn my head. My left arm had a line in it. My head ached with the steady persistence of something that had been aching for a long time and had become the ambient condition. But I was alive. And for the first time in 3 weeks I was also strategically positioned. Hargrove was coming at 9 the following morning with full transfer documentation. I had approximately 22 hours. I needed 2 things. An ally in this building who understood what was happening, and a way to reach Sylvia before 9 the next day. The nurse who had come in earlier for vitals had paused, barely perceptibly but notably, when she checked my pulse, just a fraction longer than a routine check required. Not long enough to be certain, long enough to be notable. She had noticed something. I needed that noticing to be useful. Her name was Dana. She came back for the evening vitals at 4:30. She checked the monitors, then came to the bed and took my pulse with the same 2 fingers at my wrist. And this time I pressed back. One small, deliberate increase in pressure. The kind of signal that only registers if you're already paying the right kind of attention. She went still. She did not look at the door. She did not change her expression. She said in the same quiet clinical tone she'd use for any patient, "I'm going to check your temperature." While she waited for the reading, she leaned slightly toward the monitor she was pretending to read and said, barely above a breath, "Blink once if you can hear me." I blinked once. She straightened, made a note on her chart, then said, "I'm going to adjust your position for comfort." She moved to the side of the bed and while she adjusted the pillow, she said quietly, "You've been showing signs of awareness for 2 days. I documented it in my personal notes, not the main chart. I didn't know who to trust." I pressed her wrist once. She said, "There's a woman who's visited 3 times who isn't on the approved family list. She signed in as a family friend the first time. She has a man with her who I believe is an attorney. They came while your stepmother was here yesterday, and your stepmother asked them to leave." I pressed her wrist again. She said, "Do you want me to contact someone?" I pressed once for yes. She said, "Tell me how." I couldn't speak yet. 3 weeks of disuse and intubation had left my throat raw and barely functional. But my hand could move enough. Dana brought a notepad from the supply cart and held a pen in my right hand, angling the pad where I could reach it. I wrote 2 things, Sylvia Hale and her phone number, which I had memorized at 14 and never once forgotten. Then I wrote one more word. Tonight. Dana looked at what I had written. She looked at me. She said, "I'll call her from my personal phone on my break, not from the hospital system." I pressed her wrist. She said, "Don't open your eyes for anyone else tonight. Not until I tell you it's safe." I closed my eyes. She finished her chart notes and left. I lay in the bed and cataloged everything I had heard over 3 weeks from a position everyone believed was passive. Catherine had visited 11 times. I knew because different nurses had mentioned it in different conversations and I had been counting, even from the bottom of the fog. My father had visited 7 times. Sylvia had visited 3 times and had been asked to leave twice. A man whose name I had heard as Hargrove had visited once with Sandra on a day my father wasn't present. That visit lasted 40 minutes and involved conversations about documentation, authorizations, and the timeline for finalizing a transfer of management authority. On 2 separate occasions, a different man had spoken to my father in a lower, more careful tone, the tone of someone delivering news that required delicate handling. I had heard the phrase power of attorney. I had heard the phrase medical proxy. On the second visit, I had heard my father say, "How much longer do we need to wait?" And the other man had said, "The doctors are saying 2 more weeks before they make any permanent determinations." My father had said, "And if we move before then?" The man had said, "Then we need the documentation to be airtight." They had not been waiting for me to recover. They had been waiting for a legal timeline. I kept returning to one thing in the hours before Sylvia arrived. Not Sandra. Sandra had been announcing herself over 13 years in ways I had chosen not to read correctly. The discovery of her intentions was painful without being shocking. My father was different. My father had stood in this room and asked how much longer we need to wait while I lay in the bed 3 feet from him. That was the betrayal that had no framework I could fit it into without rebuilding the framework from the ground up. Sylvia arrived at 8:15 that evening, brought through the staff entrance by Dana during a 12-minute window between nursing rounds. I heard her footsteps before she reached the door. I had been listening to the rhythm of those footsteps my entire life. She came to the bed. She said nothing for a moment. Then very quietly, "Nadia, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." I squeezed her hand. She made a sound that wasn't a word, the sound of someone releasing a 3-week breath. She sat in the chair beside the bed and leaned close. "I'm going to tell you what I know. We have 11 minutes. I pressed her hand once. She told me. On day 4 of my hospitalization, Sandra had filed for temporary medical power of attorney, citing my father's distress and his request that she manage the medical decisions. The hospital's legal team had flagged it as irregular, but my father had confirmed the request in writing, and it had been granted on a limited basis. On day 9, Hargrove, an estate attorney Sandra had retained 18 months earlier, had submitted paperwork to the trust's financial manager requesting an emergency review of the management structure, citing my incapacitation and my father's claimed rights as co-trustee. Grace, my trust financial manager, had rejected the request and contacted Sylvia immediately. Sylvia had been in contact with Grace since day 10. Grace had been stalling through procedural requirements, requesting documentation that took time to produce, asking for clarifications that required formal responses. She had bought us time. Hargrove was coming at 9 with what Sandra had described to my father as the final transfer documentation, intended to complete a transfer of management authority over the trust's primary assets while I remained incapacitated. They believed they had 3 days before the medical team made any permanent determinations about my condition. Sylvia said, "Elena, what do you want to do?" I opened my eyes. She looked at me and didn't flinch. 40 years as an estate attorney. She had been waiting for exactly this moment. I said in a voice that came out barely above a whisper, "Hargrove cannot walk into this building tomorrow." She said, "He won't." I said, "I need Grace to have documentation of my awareness before 9. She said, "Dana has been keeping personal notes since Tuesday. Dated, time-stamped, clinically formatted. She'll sign them tonight." I said, "And the medical team?" She said, "I have a colleague who specializes in medical legal matters. He can be here by 6 tomorrow morning." I said, "They made 2 mistakes." She said, "Tell me." I said, "They used Hargrove. And Hargrove used the same trust documentation my mother built, the documentation she built with you. You know every protection in those documents. Every clause. Every condition." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They didn't bypass the authorization chain correctly." I said, "Show me." She showed me. And she was right. My mother had built the trust with a layered authorization structure, requiring independent verification at each stage of any major transaction. The verification at stage 3 required a signature from the trust's independent legal counsel, a role held by an attorney my mother had named specifically in the trust documents when she created them. That attorney was Sylvia. Catherine and Hargrove had either not known Sylvia's role in the structure, or they had known and believed she could be bypassed. Either way, the bypass had not been completed. The Stage 3 authorization was missing from every document in Hargrove's folder. The transfer had never been legally executable. By 10 that evening, Dana had signed her personal notes in the presence of Sylvia and a medical legal attorney who arrived at 9:30. By 11, Grace had a formal notification of my recovered awareness with supporting documentation from 2 medical witnesses. By 11:30, Sylvia had filed an emergency motion with the probate court requesting an immediate freeze on all trust-related transactions pending a capacity review. By midnight, Hargrove's appointment the following morning had been rendered procedurally irrelevant. I lay in the hospital bed and thought about my mother sitting at her desk 18 years ago, building protection she hoped I would never need. She had built them anyway because she had understood something that Sandra and my father had not accounted for when they began their careful 3-week process. The protections were not in the trust documents alone. The protections were in the people who had helped build them. And those people had been waiting for me to wake up. Hargrove arrived at 9:04. I know because Dana was at the nurse's station when he came through the entrance and sent me a single word on the notepad she had left with me. He opened the door with Sandra. They stopped. Sandra looked at my open eyes, at the adjusted pillow behind me, at the glass of water I had already drunk from, at Sylvia sitting in the chair with a folder on her lap, at the medical legal attorney standing near the window. Then she looked at me. I said, "Good morning, Sandra." My voice was not what it had been 3 weeks earlier. But it was present, and it was clear, and it arrived in the room with the weight of something that had been absent for 21 days and had now returned. Hargrove understood before Sandra did. He read the room in about 4 seconds and understood that the document folder under his arm was not going to be opened today. Sandra said, "You're awake." I said, "I've been awake since Thursday afternoon." She said nothing. I said, "I heard you on Thursday morning before I opened my eyes. You and my father." Her expression moved through disbelief, then calculation, then something that didn't resolve into anything I had a name for. I said, "Sylvia has filed an emergency motion with the probate court. The trust transactions are frozen pending Monday's hearing. The power of attorney is invalid as of the amended capacity assessment filed this morning." Hargrove said he'd like to speak with his client. The hallway was available. They left. My father came the following morning. Alone. Without Sandra, without Hargrove, without the performed concern he had been maintaining through 7 visits while planning the completion of a financial transfer. He stood in the doorway looking like a man who had spent 36 hours arriving at an understanding of himself that he had been carefully avoiding. He sat in the chair. He looked at his hands. He said, "I don't know how to start." I said, "Then don't start. Just tell me the truth." He told me he had known what Sandra was planning from the beginning. Not every detail, but the direction of it. She had started asking about the trust structure the year after they married. He had told himself she was curious, that she cared about my future. By the time I turned 25, he knew that wasn't true. He had kept not knowing because the alternative required him to do something he wasn't willing to do. I said, "Leave her." He said, "Yes." I said, "You chose her instead." He said yes. Just yes. No defense, no case prepared for his choices. Just the accurate description of a decision he had made. I looked at my father, 58 years old, the man who had held my hand at my mother's funeral and said we would figure everything out together, and who had meant it, I believe, in that moment, and I said, "The hearing is Monday. I need you to tell the court everything. The full extent of what was planned, the documentation you signed, the conversations with Hargrove." He said, "That will be used against Sandra." I said, "Yes." He said, "And against me?" I said, "Probably yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother would not forgive me for this." I said, "I know." He said, "Can you?" I sat with that question honestly. I said, "I don't know yet. That's the most honest answer I have." He nodded. He stood up. At the door, he looked at me one more time with the expression of a man who has laid something down that he has been carrying in the wrong direction, and is not yet sure what walking without it feels like. Then he left. The Monday hearing lasted 3 hours. My father testified first. He told the court the full extent of his knowledge, the conversations with Hargrove, the documentation he had signed, the timeline of Sandra's planning as he understood it. He answered every question without deflecting, without the managed version of events. Cost him considerably. It was also, I believe, the most honest he had been in years. The court reviewed Hargrove's transfer documentation. Sylvia had been right. My mother's trust required independent verification at each stage of any major transaction. Stage 3 required a signature from the trust's independent legal counsel, Sylvia. The bypass had not been completed. The Stage 3 authorization was missing from every document in Hargrove's folder. The transfer had never been legally executable. Not once. Not for a single day. My mother had known. Not exactly what, but enough to add one more layer in the last weeks of her life. A 3-hour phone call with Sylvia. 2 small changes to the documents. One of them was the stage 3 requirement. She had added it for a daughter who was 14 years old and didn't yet know why it would matter. She had done it anyway because that was who she was. The court froze all pending transactions, invalidated Sandra's power of attorney with retroactive effect, and referred the matter to the district attorney for investigation of potential fraud, forgery, and financial misconduct. My father was removed as co-trustee. I was confirmed as sole controlling authority. Sandra was arrested 4 months later. The investigation uncovered forged authorization documents Hargrove had prepared for the Stage 3 verification. Documents that had never been deployed because the window closed before they could be used. The forgery charge transformed the case from a civil dispute about trust management into a criminal matter, with specific evidence of intent. Hargrove surrendered his law license. Sandra's assets were frozen. The luxury items she had purchased in the weeks following my accident, already anticipating the transfer's completion, were subject to recovery proceedings. My father cooperated fully with the investigation. His cooperation was taken into account, but it did not eliminate consequence. He was removed permanently from any role in the trust structure. He faced civil liability for his participation and settled by paying back into the trust the amount he had been paid from its accounts during the period when he had been acting against my interests. By the time the settlement was reached, he was living alone. Sandra had moved out when the arrest became imminent. She had calculated that proximity to him no longer served her, and had acted on it with the same efficiency she had applied to everything else. I left the hospital 12 days after the Monday hearing. Dana walked me to the exit. At the door, she said, "You were the calmest person I've ever seen in a situation like that." I said, "I had a very good teacher." She looked at me. I said, "My mother. She taught me that the protection is in the people who help you build it, not just in the documents." Dana said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." I said, "She was precise." Which, it turned out, was the same thing. 8 months after the accident, I sat in Grace's office for our first quarterly review since I had taken full control. The trust was intact. The properties were performing. The investment account continued to grow with the conservative patience my mother had established. Her careful work had survived all of it. The following Saturday, Sylvia came to dinner at my apartment. I cooked the way my mother had taught me, with attention rather than speed. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about things that weren't the case, weren't the hearing, weren't the hospital. We talked about my mother. Sylvia said she would have found the whole thing infuriating. I said she would have found it predictable. Sylvia laughed and said that too. Then she said, she knew what she was protecting against when she built those documents. She had seen it happen in other families. She wanted to make sure you had something that would hold, even if the people around you didn't. I said, "The Stage 3 requirement." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. She called me the week before she died. Said she wanted to go through the documents one more time. We spent 3 hours on the phone. She made 2 small changes. She looked at her wine glass. One of them was the Stage 3 requirement. I said, "She added it in that call." Sylvia said, "Yes. I thought about my mother in the last weeks of her life, managing her company from a chair, her body making its way toward an end she could see clearly, precise enough and honest enough and loving enough to call her attorney at that stage and add one more clause to a document for a 14-year-old daughter who didn't yet know why it would ever matter. She had done it anyway, because that was who she was. Precision, it turns out, is one of the most enduring forms of love. And some protections are built not for the moment you're living in, but for the moment you don't yet know is coming. My mother built hers 18 years in advance. She got it exactly right. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever had someone in your corner who quietly built something that protected you long after they were gone, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is a woman who was precise when it mattered most.